Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our convocation. My name is Jim Simons, and I would like to urge us during this program to use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen for questions. Our speaker is brilliant at answering questions, and we'd like to have as many questions as we can. So please use that chat. You can ask your questions directly, but we encourage you to use the chat and then type in your question. Our reader of scripture and prayer will be led today by Barbara Matthew.
Thank you, Jim. The scripture today is Philippians 2, 1 through 18, suggested by our speaker, Dr. Du Mez. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in accord, and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus the Lord, Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Thanks to the Lord for Paul's letter to the church he established at Philippi. Let us pray together. Creator God, you took on human form to walk among and with us, not to be exalted, but to serve and to save. You showed us by your own actions to regard others as better than ourselves, to put the interests of another ahead of our own. We pray we allow your will to work within and through us as we go about this human journey. We are humbled in your presence, O God, as we confess that Jesus is Lord, and in whose name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Barbara. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tom Eggebeen, who will present our speaker. Tom.
Jim, thank you very, very much. We welcome today Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez, Professor of History and Gender Studies at Kelvin University, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dr. Du Mez, reared in Sioux Center, Iowa, is a graduate of Dordt College, where her father was a professor. And she holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. Early on, the title of her book caught my attention, Jesus and John Wayne. But it was the subtitle that gave me both pause and hope. How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Since I'm a graduate of Kelvin and a history major, with Dutch culture in my veins and deep concern for all things Reformed, I knew this was a book to read, and read it I did several times. Dr. Du Mez writes with honesty, lucidity, and scholarship, and I would add, kindness. Her work has been well and widely received, featured in major publications and countless podcasts. Her analysis is clear, sharp-elbowed, as some have noted, yet her work is suffused with hope for better days and a deeply pastoral concern. Her influence continues to grow, opening doors of insight and conversation, liberation and healing. I can't think of better words to describe her work than those of the hymn, "Open my eyes that I may see glimpses of truth thou hast for me." We are privileged to welcome to the Grove today Dr. Kristin Du Mez.
Thank you, Tom and Jim, and thank you, Tom, especially for your persistence in making this happen and for working with my volatile schedule. So I really appreciate it. It's really good to be here with all of you tonight, or I guess this afternoon for you. I'm calling it tonight here. So yes, it's my pleasure to talk with you. I'll give you a bit of an overview of the book. So in case you haven't read it, you know kind of what we're dealing with here. And then I'm very eager to take your questions and see where the conversation brings us. So this week is an especially busy week because it is the release of the Paperback Edition. And the Paperback Edition has a new preface. And I'm actually kind of sad about that because it contains the story that I usually start off my talks with. So now I'm going to have to come up with a new way to start my talks, but I haven't yet. So I'm still going to use it because it connects to my work at Calvin so nicely. As I write about in the new preface, the idea for this book actually started more than 15 years ago. And it was my students at Calvin who introduced me to the subject of evangelical masculinity. So I was a brand new professor. I don't even know the exact year, if it was my first year or second year, one of the first times I was teaching my US survey course. So either 2005 or 2006. And I decided to introduce my students to the study of gender in history, because that was something I had never learned at Dordt, suffice it to say. And it wasn't until I got to graduate school that I was introduced to the idea of gender being much more than simply, could women serve in church office? That was the extent of conversations around gender as far as I was exposed to them when I was growing up in the Christian Reformed Church. And I thought it was rather dull, frankly. I mean, it was yes or it was no, and everybody just disagreed, and that was that. When I got to graduate school, my very first semester, I read a book on the history of gender and race in colonial America, and I came to see that gender was about so much more than if women could serve as pastors, that ideas of masculinity and femininity changed over time, and that they were linked to changing economics and to foreign policy, to race, to religion, and to, in the case into foreign policy as well. And so I wanted to bring some of that to my Calvin students, again, as a new faculty member. And so I designed a lecture looking at Teddy Roosevelt, who is just such a perfect example if you want to talk about masculinity and how masculinity is connected to economics and foreign policy and American power. And so I put together this lecture. I was pretty happy with it, thought it went well. And after the class period, two students came up to me, two guys from the class, and said, "Professor Du Mez, there is this book that you have got to read." And I actually have that book right here. And it is John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart, Discovering the Secret of a Man's Soul. And so I took their advice. I went down to Family Christian Bookstore and I bought a copy, and I opened it up, and I immediately saw what they were talking about, because Eldredge opens his book with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And then in the spirit of Roosevelt, he goes on to craft a vision of Christian manhood that is extremely militant and militaristic. And so for Eldredge, God is a warrior God, and every man is made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. And I thought this struck me for a couple of reasons. One, for for all their talk about being kind of Bible believing Christians, right? Evangelicals, that's kind of their thing. It was striking how little of the scriptures there actually was in this book on Christian manhood. Instead, Eldredge really drew on secular heroes, on Hollywood heroes, on mythical warriors, on cowboys and soldiers, and especially Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. And he used these models to then construct his idea of Christian masculinity, a very militant conception of Christian masculinity. Now, at the same time, this was again around 2005 or 2006 when I was encountering this this literature, because I soon discovered that Eldredge was just the tip of the iceberg. There were dozens of books on Christian masculinity that looked almost exactly the same. It was almost verging on plagiarism. And I also noticed a lot of survey data that was coming out on white evangelicals at the time. Now, this was the early years of the Iraq War. And we had all this data that showed how white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support the Iraq War, to support preemptive war in general, to condone the use of torture, to embrace aggressive foreign policy. And so I just asked what the question that historians had asked of Teddy Roosevelt: what might one thing have to do with the other? What might this militant conception of masculinity have to do with militant foreign policy and American empire? And so that started me down this winding path. I spent about 1.5 years working with a research student at Calvin on this topic back then. And what I found was incredibly disturbing, to be honest. This was the height of the Mark Driscoll era. And I was just coming across sermons and books that to me were incredibly misogynistic and dangerously militant, I thought. And then I ended up putting the project aside. I gave a couple of talks at the National Women's Studies Association. I gave a talk at Calvin's Paul Henry Institute. And then I set the project aside for a couple of reasons. One, I had another book to finish first. And I also had a baby, and then I had another baby, and then I had a third one. And so I was trying to write 2 books at the same time. And I was like, no, I can't. Okay, that's unrealistic. So I have to finish the dissertation first. But I also was troubled by a couple of things. One, again, it was so disturbing, the evidence that I was coming across, and revolting, really. So I wasn't sure if I wanted to spend years of my life, what it would take to write a book, immersed in this world. And connected to that, it wasn't clear to me how mainstream this was. On the one hand, I knew that John Eldredge's book sold more than 4 million copies. That's mainstream. I knew that Mark Driscoll was enormously popular in white evangelical spaces, among pastors, among young men. And still, it just felt so extreme, what I was reading, what I was encountering. And so I didn't quite know how to tease that out. And I had this question of, if this is fringe, is it responsible of me as a Christian and as a Christian scholar to be shining the bright light on what might be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity? Is that really what I should be doing? And so for all of those reasons, I ended up just setting the project aside, thinking I'll pick it up later. At some point, I'll come back to this. And I did in the fall of 2016. I was working on another project at the time, never quite got around to these sources again, and still meeting at some point. And I should say I never stopped paying attention to these guys who were her proponents of this militant Christian masculinity. And in that decade, while I was working on other things, I kept tabs on many of them. And what I noticed is one after another of these guys became implicated in scandal, abuse of power or sexual abuse, either directly as perpetrators or indirectly defending friends of theirs who were perpetrators. And so I kind of kept tabs on that. Then it was the fall of 2016, October 2016, to be specific, when we had the release of the Access Hollywood tape, if you recall that moment. By then, it was just weeks before the 2016 election. It was very clear that white evangelicals were supporting Donald Trump by that time. And then we had the release of those horrible tapes. And the country kind of stopped. The world really did, to watch what will white evangelicals do now. This was the infamous grab 'em by the pussy recording. And, a lot of people thought there's no way that that evangelicals can stand behind an abuser now that we have these videos out there. And of course they did. Within a week, and the few who had wavered, people like Wayne Grudem, who for a moment said, maybe we can't support him, he decided to pray about it, and within a week was back on supporting Trump again. And that's when it clicked for me. That's when I thought, we have seen this before. We have seen this so many times before in evangelical spaces, right? Where we have seen evangelicals support abusive leaders. And so at that point, I started watching very closely. A few weeks later, we had the election, and that's when we had the infamous 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump, according to those exit polls. And that's when I decided I needed to write this book, because at that point, the narrative had been, how could evangelicals betray their values to vote for somebody like Donald Trump? And from the research I had done on evangelical masculinity, I knew that wasn't the right framing. I knew that evangelicals hadn't betrayed their values, many of them, to vote for Donald Trump. That suggestion ignored the fact that for many evangelicals, their values aligned very closely with those of Donald Trump. And particularly if we look at family values evangelicalism, and if we understand, as historically I think we must understand, that at the heart of family values evangelicalism was the assertion of white patriarchal power. And once we place that at the center of family values evangelicalism, then a whole lot of things start to fall into place. And that's really what I do in this book. So it's essentially a book of white evangelical masculinity and militarism as they are intertwined throughout the last 75 years or so of American history. When it came time to title the book, I mean, I had Jesus and John Wayne, but the subtitle took us about 3 months to agree on. And part of the problem was that I'd always considered this my book on evangelical masculinity and militarism. And then the sales team came back. I went with a trade publisher. And that's, I think, in part why the book reads so well. It's meant for general audiences, why we've had such great publicity, and the book has gotten a lot of attention. So all good. But their sales team had veto power. And they informed us that I could use neither the words masculinity nor militarism anywhere in the title or subtitle because they were too long. And they wanted to sell the book. And so we really had to go back to the drawing boards. And what we came up with, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation, really was the result of a long process of trying to just think about, distill, what is this book really about? And why does it matter? And the subtitle reflects that, I think, two purposes. I'll start with the simpler part, the fractured a nation. This book matters not just for evangelicals and not just for people who care about evangelicals. This story matters for our country. It matters for the state of American democracy right now, even more than I realized when I was writing this book, to be honest. As I was writing it, kept bumping up across this sense that, wow, evangelicals talk about authority an awful lot. They talk about, submission to power, and that's gendered, but it's more than that. And I kept thinking, this is really anti-democratic. This really does have some authoritarian tendencies. And I honestly didn't really know what to do with that when I was looking at this literature from the 1960s, from the 1970s. And so I bring out these themes of authority. And now we can see some real resonances in terms of survey data on evangelicals and authoritarian tendencies as well. So the book matters just for the nation, I think. But that first part of the subtitle, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith, that's the part that I had to really, really think about. Do I want that on the cover of the book? Not for the reason you might imagine, not because it is very sharp-elbowed, but because that is not a historical claim, right? This is a work of history, and it's being read by people who who are, it actually has a lot of fans among atheist crowds. It's a big hit among Revolutionary Communist Party folks. And it's a big hit in religious circles, including in evangelical circles. But that actually is me speaking not as a historian, but that's me speaking to evangelicals on their own terms. I'm making a normative claim there, and I'm speaking as a Christian scholar, actually. And I was surprised, frankly, that my publisher let me do this because I'm speaking to Bible-believing Christians who self-identify as that and who claim to pattern their life around that, who claim that it's theology that drives everything, drives their cultural identity, drives their politics. And what I show in this book is how often that script is flipped, right? It's how often culture and political allegiances end up transforming understandings of Christianity. And so what I show is how this model of kind of militant warrior masculinity that evangelicals embrace ended up not just transforming ideals of Christian manhood, but also transforming the faith itself and transforming the Jesus of the Gospels at the center of that faith, so that Jesus becomes not the Christ that we just read about in our opening scripture, but Jesus becomes a warrior with tattoos down his leg who is charging on a horse, wielding a bloody sword, charging into battle where he's going to slay all of his enemies. And that's the Christ that we are to follow. I show in this book how biblical teachings like loving your neighbor as yourself, loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, how these are just dismissed. They're just tossed out. No, that doesn't apply to this. You can't teach a boy to be a man by teaching him to turn the other cheek. I show how historical doctrines of the Trinity are really set aside in order to come up with a model of that supposedly supports women's submission. These are just countless examples, really, where cultural and political ideals end up driving theological interpretation. And so that corrupted a faith is me really speaking to evangelicals themselves on their own terms. And I'm glad I went with that subtitle, because that's exactly how the vast majority of evangelicals who are reading this book are receiving it. And so I'll just wrap up by saying the book came out almost exactly a year ago. It was on June 23 that we launched the book. And I mean, I had been warned to brace myself for vicious trolling. The publisher's lawyer helped me prepare. I mean, every sentence of this book has been vetted. That last chapter vetted 3 times over. And then she told me, just, brace yourself. And then we had this great launch day interview with Steve Inskeep on Morning Edition. So what every writer dreams of. And then within a couple of days, the letters started coming into my inbox, the messages. And it was not hate mail, as I say in the new preface. It's been amazing. Letters of thanks from evangelical readers, all of whom start off with some version of, this is the story of my life. And then they give all of these details. Some of them will send pictures of their bookshelves that have all the books on that I talk about. They'll tell about their, attending Promise Keepers rallies. They'll tell about their youth group experiences. They'll tell about how they struggled in their early marriage to pattern their lives after these teachings. Some will say how they left the faith, how they left evangelicalism, or how they left Christianity altogether. And I still receive several of these every day, and they just keep coming. And so the response among evangelicals has been absolutely remarkable. And evangelicals have been the book's biggest promoters. Not all, I will say, but many evangelicals have just been amazing. This book has lived on social media. That's where the publicity is happening. And like Tom said, I have done well over 100 podcasts. I think I recorded 2 today. I have another one tomorrow morning. And many of these just reach small audiences. And I'm exhausted. I realize at some point I just need to say no, but I keep doing these because I love them. I love these conversations. Each one is a little bit different. There's some overlapping questions by this point, but each conversation is unique. And it's these little podcasts in particular that are getting this book into the spaces that most need to grapple with this. And so there's usually, one person who says, hey guys, we need to engage this, right? Or we need to, and so invites me into those spaces, often conservative evangelical spaces. And with almost no exceptions, I've been treated with respect and hospitality in those spaces, and a lot of gratefulness. So that's something we didn't expect with this book, and that's really been remarkable. So when I finished the book, I tell this story from time to time. I didn't actually have a ton of hope, to be honest. So much so that my editor, just before it went into production, we're doing the final reads, and he just said, Kristen, this is a really depressing book. I was like, yeah. And he's like, no, you can't leave your readers here. You can't leave your readers with this. And so I took a look at the manuscript and thought, what do I have to work with? And then I just emailed him and said, I've got nothing. I'm as depressed as you are, and this is where I'm at, and this is what I have. And he said, okay, I respect that. And then about a day or two later, I got another email, and he's like, Kristen, just give us anything. And so that's when I gave him the last sentence of the book. What was once done might also be undone. And I've said this before, but I felt so sheepish sending that off to him. It just felt too feeble. And he's a very, very tough critic. And to my surprise, he just said, okay, I'll take it. And that was it. And the book went into production. And, but that is true. First of all, it's true because that's what history shows us. History shows us that nothing is inevitable. History shows us that things haven't always been this way. And it shows us how things got to be this way, right? Individual people were making choices, varying motivations, but often to enhance their own power. And we can see that happen. And so that frees us up to ask, is this where we want to be today? And as we see how we got here, then we can perhaps embark on taking some things apart and trying again. And so I'm actually more hopeful now in many ways than I was when I finished this manuscript, because of the response to the book in spaces where I never would have imagined that they would have engaged it with such humility and with such honesty. So yeah, that's I think my overview that I'll leave you with. I see what percentage of the positive responses are from male readers. I'd say probably 60-40 male readers, maybe even a little bit higher than that. So I get a lot of, I've been trying to figure out the breakdown. I think my next book which is on femininity, will probably have disproportionate, female readers. This one, more men. It's kind of close. But I would say more men than women probably are reading it.
Kristen, one of the things that came up in my reading, and I think you've noted in some podcasts or other things that I've read of you, that not only has this hurt a lot of women, obviously, with Maribel Morgan on the one hand, or Phyllis Schlafly on the other hand, soft and sweet, tough and militant, but submissive ultimately to authority. Not only has that hurt a lot of women and deprived them of their voice, but at the same time, it has hurt a lot of men.
Yes.
Who are said, this is what a man needs to be. And maybe just quietly at night, they think to themselves, no, this is not what I am. So what's wrong with me?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I will say the stories are just heartbreaking. First of all, I think the most painful stories in terms of letters I received are from women and are from survivors, right? And many of the women, so the whole last chapter of the book is it chronicles abuse in evangelical circles, and many of the women whose stories are included there have contacted me since this book has come out and have just said thank you for making their stories a part of history. And for validating them in that way, and for holding evangelicalism as a movement accountable. And many have really just said it helps them find peace, actually, because it wasn't just the abuse that messed with them, although obviously it did. Long-term psychologically, what was harder was the struggling to come to terms with how so many of their friends and even family members didn't support them. ended up blaming them. And it has just been, again, they could see that it wasn't just them. This book shows that this is a part of a larger pattern, and there are reasons for it, and they run deep. So that has been really heartening. But yes, many men have reached out to me too, to say, well, some have owned complicity. Many have, saying, I did this. I was a pastor. I've had Zoom calls with evangelical leaders who are just distraught after reading this book, saying, I contributed to this 35 years of my ministry, and I built this up, and now I see what I've done. And it's hard. Then there are many men who just, again, this is a story of their life. They talk about always feeling like an outsider, never feeling like they measured up, because who really measures up to this warrior masculinity? Very few men do. But this is still held up as the ideal. So then men have to decide, the problems with them, it seems. So some end up walking away from Christianity because, it's not for them. Many end up feeling, as I quote in the book, one man talked about feeling like a second-class Christian and not a real man. And then what was interesting is, some men end up then kind of accepting their identity as beta males and don't reject this ideology or this ideal of masculinity, but instead kind of give their loyalty to the alpha male in the room, in the organization, in the country, saying, clearly I'm not worthy of this sort of leadership, but that guy is, just look at him. And so there's varying responses. I've heard from men with disabilities. I cite one of those in the book, and I've heard from many after, saying this vision of masculinity and this whole model of men's ministries, there's no place for a man who doesn't have the kind of physical stamina. And again, feeling like second-class Christians and feeling like not real men. So there's a lot of pain that people are working through, a lot of wounds, I think, that are being exposed. I honestly had no inkling how emotional the response to this book was going to be. I anticipated anger being the primary emotion, and that is absolutely not it. Well, it's anger, not at the book. It's anger at evangelicalism. It's anger sometimes at themselves. And it's a lot of grief. It is a lot of grief of people sensing for so long that things are not right, things are not well, but never being able to articulate exactly why. And then again, thinking the problem must be with them. And then this kind of holds it out and say, no, the problem is here. We can identify it. And this is your story. And so your story maps onto this. But it's a lot to process, I think, for a lot of people emotionally. And that's something that I've been trying to kind of walk alongside readers in various ways this year. I did not anticipate at all as a historian, right? Usually in the past, I've written about people who are already dead. And so this book is very different. People are living, people have lived this life. And so it connects with readers in a very different way.
Thank you so very, very much. I have a question about your hometown. And of course, it was at Dordt College where famously or infamously, the former president made reference to the fact that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose a voter. And then 81% of Sioux County, whatever.
It was higher. Yeah.
Voted. Now, what's happening in your home area these days?
So, with COVID, I haven't been back since this book has come out. I've been back a lot, but just briefly over the past 20 years. So I haven't lived there in a very long time. So I don't speak with great authority on about Sioux Center and Sioux Center, evangelicals, if you will, Sioux Center Christians. What I think it kind of mirrors the larger evangelical landscape in that I would say the majority, I know the majority are, conservative, Republican, and Trump supporting. But there is a contingent who is not. And like within the rest of evangelicalism, it's very, very difficult, right? It's difficult because these divisions run through churches, not just communities, but in churches and through families. And so we have people just kind of staring at each other on the opposite sides of this divide, wondering, who are you and who is your Jesus and what is your faith? And just these are, really feel diametrically opposed. And so I think this book makes sense of that. So I will say I have some really big fans in Sioux Center. That's also the place where I ran up against some of the harshest criticism. I was scheduled originally to go give a talk at Dordt. Now, I will say that they didn't invite, the person who invited me knew what this book was about, but then he left Dordt and no longer worked there. And then the book came out, and then I was on the schedule, and then they got cold feet. And largely because there's a group, Sioux County Conservatives, that's very active and like in the worst trollish kind of ways. It's a Facebook group, and they really troll Dordt, and they troll, anybody who's not super right wing. And so they were drawing attention, very negative attention to me and my visit. And there was some threatening behavior there. I mean, I was told that I should arrange for security. And I think Dordt, maybe, I can't really speak for them, kind of hoping I'd back out. And it was right in, COVID, should we not? And I was like, I'm not backing out, and I'm going to show up, and I'm going to give this talk, and I'm going to give it on that stage where Donald Trump gave his talk on the, and I'm going to be there, and people can like it or not like it, but I'm going to be there. But then COVID cases spiked the week before, and we had to move it remote. So I never got to visit campus. A lot of people who are huge supporters, quietly, some vocally, and then a lot of detractors. But I do know the book is very much making its way through Sioux Center, and I don't know what it'll be like when I go back. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that's going to be, but
well, it'll be exciting.
I can't really hide anymore. Like everybody knows what I think. So,
I over the last I don't know, a couple of years now, one of the things I've noted, and Kristen, certainly your book is sort of the lead on all of this, but a number of what I consider to be seriously important books. I'm thinking of Anthea Butler's work, for example, or Beth Allison Barr in her latest, Amy Bird.
Yeah.
That this work is being done by women coming out of, or at least some close reference to, the evangelical culture. I'm sure the four of you are talking now and then.
Yeah.
When the four of you talk, what do you talk about?
I just had a journalist ask for some of my texts back and forth with Beth, and we have probably hundreds, thousands back and forth. So yeah. And Anthea's great. I didn't know Amy much at all, but we've done a couple of events together. So, I think in part because Amy's not in academic spaces as much. And so, and her book is different, and she is still within conservative spaces much more so than I am. And certainly Anthea, Beth is somewhere in between. What do we talk about? Oh my gosh. Let me see. This is being recorded, isn't it? I mean, Anthea and I, she's just awesome. She's really the bravest scholar that I know. She does not care about offending people. She doesn't go out of her way to offend people, but and she doesn't care about alienating people. I'm not saying just in terms of what she's saying, but I mean, I had an instance where a major outlet appeared to plagiarize my book, and it was this really difficult moment, just like 3 weeks after the book released, and everybody was talking about it. It was so obvious. And so but I know a lot of religion scholars did not want to come out and say anything because you don't want to alienate the religion reporter at the major newspaper in the country. And so Anthea, I had never met her at the time, gloves off, guns blazing, came to my defense publicly. And I just, I watched it at great cost. So she, will not be interviewed in those and quoted in those pages. And so, I really admire her, because so much of what I've seen, and I wrote about this recently, actually at the Times, but different part of the Times, about how evangelicals have have tried to kind of control their narratives and have not faced the difficult truths. And how, so often in this book, I came across time and again, just the tendency to show deference, to show deference to those in authority, to show deference to those who wield power. So hopefully they'll kind of show you favors. But that's not just within evangelicalism, it's within academia, it's just the way the world works. But for people who resist that, who courageously speak the truth in whatever context, even though it will come at personal cost to them. And even when it's not even about them, but they're standing up for what is true, even when it costs. I mean, those are people I really admire. So I put Anthea in that place. Beth and I, we blog together. We've worked together. I just came from an event at Baker Book House, which is, her publisher. And so, we just talk a lot about, I give her a lot of tips. I've kind of been out front a few months before she is. So I give her tips on how to handle media, how to handle social media. And we talk about what it's like in this moment where our books are both, again, just really, really living on social media. We're getting all kinds of free publicity, earnest publicity, just from people who read these books and say, hey guys, you have to read this book. Unprecedented. My publisher has never seen anything remotely like this. And so we talk about how this is a remarkable moment because there's a democratizing influence of social media, that it doesn't matter if Christianity Today didn't like Jesus and John Wayne. It doesn't matter if Lifeway Christian Books isn't going to sell our books. They won't. None of that matters. Because we have, through podcasts, through social media, we have our own grassroots distribution networks and publicity machines. And like all of this is just generosity. It's people coming to us and saying, can I promote your work? I mean, I have so many people coming to me just saying, I can give you this. Can I do this for you? Can I produce a video series for you and pay our publicists to promote it just because we want people in our denomination to read your work? So it's been amazing. And we're experiencing this together, and just both experiencing it and then stepping back and reflecting on it as scholars, saying, wow, this is really interesting. And the landscape has shifted and the power dynamics have absolutely shifted. And we're seeing that in real time.
During your, I think in your book and in several podcasts wherein I've heard you, you've made a distinction that's very dear to me, a distinction between being Reformed and being evangelical.
Yeah.
I realize you're not a professional theologian, which is probably a godsend at this point in time. But could you comment a bit more on how that has read itself out in your life, evangelical or Reformed? I consider myself Reformed.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, there are many evangelicals who are Reformed, right? And many Reformed folks who are evangelicals. And I grew up on the edge of evangelicalism because I never identified as an evangelical, right? I'm, CRC, Northwest Iowa, Dordt. My mom immigrated from the Netherlands, very, confessional and kind of this ethnic identity. So I think that also, you can see how I could write a book like this. I'm kind of on the edges looking in, familiar with certain dynamics. I had to do a lot of research to figure out this world, but I had some familiarity going in, but I didn't have the same baggage because I never identified as an evangelical growing up. I identified against evangelicals, right? We were Reformed. We were smarter than evangelicals. Like that's the way I grew up, we get things right. They get a lot of stuff wrong. Right. My dad's a theology professor. So, that said, looking back, I realized how, in Sioux Center, there was one bookstore, a Christian bookstore. There is, I grew up listening to Christian music, only Christian music, never the top 40 because that was sinful. Listening to Christian radio. And that was evangelicalism, right? That was this evangelical popular culture. And so it did shape me, even though I didn't really identify in that way. And so because I look at evangelicalism as a cultural movement and particularly look at popular culture, this culture of evangelicalism, that's how that's really the definition of evangelicalism that I'm working with, more so than a theological definition. So the question is, how deeply have you been immersed in this world of evangelical popular culture? And so to get to the Reformed question, there's a kind of evangelical version of Reformed Christianity. I talk about the John Piper and the New Calvinists and the influence of Calvinism in the SBC and complementarianism and all that. That's Reformed, right? That wasn't my Reformed tradition. And so when I got into graduate school, leaving Northwest Iowa and arriving at Notre Dame, and I'm studying American evangelicalism, I'm with students who are real evangelicals, with students who are coming from Wheaton College, from Moody Bible Institute. We had Bob Jones IV in our cohort, right? So that's where I'm like, oh, okay, they had different stories, they had all this stuff, but our point of intersection was the evangelical popular culture. So I know the Christian music, I knew some of this stuff. So and it was at that time too that Reformed Christianity really started to take hold within evangelicalism. It was the cool thing, right? New Calvinism and Desiring God. Everybody was reading Desiring God. My university Bible study, that's what we read. And I remember reading it thinking this doesn't really do much for me. And what I realized is, my Reformed Christianity, I had read, Calvin's Institutes. I'd taken an entire course on it. I'd read Kuyper. I'd read Doyward. I knew Reformed theology. I identified as that, and yet there was no place for me in those New Calvinist circles, right? There was no place for a woman who I wouldn't even identify as a feminist back then. I was coming from Dordt. I didn't really know what feminism was, and it was a bad thing as far as I'd heard. But I still, as a single woman and an intellectual, there was no space for me there. And the theology wasn't what I had come to love. As the things about that theology were not the things that I had come to love about Reformed theology, covenant theology, right? And this emphasis on patriarchy, this emphasis on authority and submission and all that. That was not the Calvinism. It's not to say that you can't find that in Calvinism. That was not the Calvinism that was taught to me at Dordt. It was not taught to me by John Vanderstelt. And looking back, I realized it might have been very telling that the professors who taught me Reformed theology and Reformed history were not American. They were Canadian or they were Dutch Canadian. And so my Reformed identity was very different from that of the neo-Calvinists that were suddenly all the rage. And at first I was like, oh, this is great. This is like our moment to shine. Like everybody's talking about Reformed Christianity now. This is it, guys, right? And then I realized oh, this is not it. This is not my faith. And there's no place for me in these communities.
If you were to write Jesus and John Wayne all over again, what changes might you make?
Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't gotten that one before. Congratulations, because I've been asked a gazillion questions. So first of all, I'm really happy with the book. It was an intense writing process. I wrote the whole thing in 18 months, and there's a lot of, I had a year of research, and then I sat down, I got the contract and I wrote it. And then I was supposed to have 8 months to edit it. And my editor read the manuscript and said, yeah, we're going to move up your deadline by 4 months. So it went from 8 months to 4 months to edit the book, which is an absolutely just impossible turnaround, but we did it. So it was a lot. I didn't actually, the first time I kind of I had a little space from it, it was out of my hands. He approved it. And then it came back for copy edits. And that's when I really first read it. And I thought, oh, this is good. This says exactly what I want it to say. If I had had more time, there are things that are missing from the book. I did not have time. So I made these choices. And I'm going to make up for it a little bit in my next book, but more economic analysis, more attention to evangelicals' views of the economy. A chapter that's missing, a decade that's missing from this book, and intentionally so, is the 1930s. And that's where we can see that this rise of free enterprise capitalism, which I mentioned in passing, but that's another strand that could play a much larger role. Prosperity gospel teachings, and connecting both of those strands to Trump and his, the businessman side of him. I give a few nods in that direction. I could have done so much more, but I needed a few more months. And I was also way up against word count. I was 60,000 words over in the first draft. And so I had to whittle a ton away from this. If I had had more time and space, I would also like to have done a bit more. I don't know if my editor would have gone for this, but I couldn't have done the ethnographic work, but a little bit more of the I'd originally proposed a chapter of this book towards the end on alternative evangelical masculinities, knowing that this, more dominant warrior masculinity is not the only one available. In the 1990s chapter, I talk about, we have all these different expressions of Christian masculinity, and they overlap, they're contradictory, and so on. And then I keep the thread that I pull through is the more militant conception of Christian masculinity. I argue that ends up being the dominant one, but the other ones don't disappear. And so I would have loved to have, and I'm hoping that other authors will come in and provide some more of this, like complicating this of understanding how the servant leadership one. It very much fuels this Jesus and John Wayne Christianity, but it doesn't always. Sometimes it moves things in a different direction. I would have liked a bit more of a kind of ethnographic. How do individual men navigate these kind of conflicting scripts of masculinity available to them? How do they process some of these? How do they, even as they uphold these ideals for a leader at the national level, again, where some of them are like, I can't live into this, I can't do this, but this is what a real leader looks like, and that's why I'm going to give my loyalty there. How do they live out, kind of their understanding of masculinity? Those are things that I just could not put into this book. It also moves me a little bit outside of my area of expertise into more ethnographic studies, but I would love for other writers to kind of explore these different scripts and how they interact with this. Oh, I also really wanted to do, see, there's a lot of things I couldn't fit into this. I had originally done more, I would like to include more in terms of Black Protestant and quote unquote evangelical masculinities, but particularly Hispanic evangelical masculinities. And that's where you find a lot more overlap with this Jesus and John Wayne mentality. The problem with that is the category is just so diverse. And there are just so many different strands just within that topic. And I really need to just focus on the white evangelical masculinity. And then finally, I have a paragraph or two at the end of the book, and it's on the global reach. And I originally intended to do a whole chapter on that. And then for space and time, had to just bring it down. But I have a lot of research on that. And since the book has come out, I've been contacted by Christians around the world, probably a dozen different countries, talking about how this ideology has impacted their churches and communities. And so I could do that in the future. But anything I've really changed, I don't know, I'm pretty... Given the time that I had and given the space that I had, I'm pretty happy with it. I think my editor would have liked, if we had another week or two, he would have liked me. He just kept saying, do we really have to hear about all of these guys, Kristen? So like every time I'd like thin out a few more, then I'd thin out a few more. But this is the difference between a kind of secular reader, right? Somebody who doesn't know this world, who's like, oh my gosh, do we have, how many of these? And then evangelical readers, the opposite. They're like, but why didn't you include him and him and him and him, right? Like they just, and I kind of told them, like, I kind of do, right? I need to show the patterns here. I need to show, because this is evangelicalism, it's networks, it's alliances, and it's really mapping out a whole different way of understanding what evangelicalism is. So yes, we need a lot of names, but there are a lot of names, and I think I maybe could have thinned it out a little bit more.
We're nearing the end of our allotted time. Tiara, there are a few comments in the sidebar. You want to highlight those for Kristen?
I see that. How long will it take for this to be undone? Is that what you're referring to, those comments?
Yeah, that was one of the comments.
Yeah. I have no idea. I try to try to end on a hopeful note. But I don't know, in our lifetime, is it going to be completely undone? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. It can be undone individually, and it is being undone, right? This, the word that a lot of people are using is deconstruction. Some people by that mean deconstructing their entire Christian faith. Some people more, just deconstructing. Most people, I think, mean by it deconstructing these kind of cultural layers and trying to actually revitalize their faith and go back to the scriptures. And so how long will this take? I don't know. It depends on the day. For me, like last night, I was kind of asked the question and it was in a dark place. I was like, this is not going to change, guys. Like, this is not, yes, Beth Barr's book is out there, and that's going to change lives. It's changing individual lives. But the patterns that we see here then are people walk away. They fight within the institutions. Look at Russell Moore, look at Beth Moore. And then at a certain point, they're like, you know what, I'm out. And then they leave. And this has happened. We can celebrate their courage or whatever, but they stayed in a long time. They were each complicit in different ways. Beth Moore has acknowledged that. I think Russell Moore will have to at some point. He's kind of acknowledged that a tiny bit. But this has been repeated, thousands, probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times of people who try to change and then finally like, you know what, I'm out. So what happens then is the institutions that they leave behind often become more conservative, more reactionary, because those voices of dissent are gone. And so, even though this evangelical reckoning, as Ed Stetzer calls it, is real, and I know because I hear the stories every single day, I'm not super optimistic about institutions. There I see the status quo being reinforced, these values, a kind of retrenchment. And, the donors and constituents are incredibly powerful, and it's very difficult to shift an organization right now.
Kristen, thank you very, very much. As a graduate of Calvin, I am so glad you are at Calvin. And
Thank you.
Holding down the fort in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for crying out loud, and Western Michigan, which is a whole nother topic of discussion at some point in time.
Yes.
Anyway, my thanks to you. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and blessings on your family.
Oh, thank you.
They bear the weight of all of this chaos and publicity too.
Yes.
And your colleagues and your students, may the Spirit of God keep your eyes open, that you may continue to catch glimpses of truth God has for you. And remember, when and if you make a personal appearance here in Pasadena, you got a free pizza coming your way.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for joining.
Real quick before we go, we're going to open up for a Q&A. Sorry, I had technical difficulties.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to send out a poll real quick so you guys can answer that. And then we do have one question already from William Craig. So William says, Dr. Ramirez, you wrote the foreword to the biography of Henrietta Mears that I just finished reading. The author calls her mother a modern evangelicalism, and you wrote that evangelicals today might see in Mears a refreshing counterpoint to an evangelicalism that has become immersed in combative partisan politics. Would you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I was very happy to be able to write that introduction because, this is kind of what I wasn't able to do so much in my book is, how does this more militant conception of evangelicalism with roots in fundamentalism interact with other expressions? I like to talk about IVP evangelicalism, for example, University Press, who it's much more diverse, much more, progressive on many issues. And that's real. And that's, a part of the mix too. So, but then I also look at power dynamics. And so within any organization, so let's look at Crew, let's look at, really any evangelical organization and where the boundaries drawn and where are the donors pulling and what are the dynamics in these spaces. So Henrietta Mears is a fascinating figure because, if you're looking at kind of patriarchal evangelicalism, she's this very interesting figure because she taught people like Billy Graham, widely respected teacher, not preacher, not pastor, but Sunday school teacher. So she stayed within her proper boundaries, and was very careful to do so, but was essentially a woman who was teaching scriptures to a whole lot of men who would then go out and evangelize and who would preach. So I think she does kind of give us a model of a different kind of evangelicalism. But then when we look at kind of power dynamics and where did the movement end up, and where did voices like Mears end up, and what were the limits that were always placed on those voices? Very important. But that would be an example of, I would love another author to come along now and to take Jesus and John Wayne and to take the Henrietta Mears story, and say, how do we write a history of evangelicalism that explains how these coexisted over time in this kind of larger fate? And I want to stress that Jesus and John Wayne is not a history of evangelicalism. It is a history of white evangelical masculinity and militarism, right? And then it argues that that is a dominant strand, but it is not a history of evangelicalism writ large.
Okay, thank you for that. And I believe Jim Simmons is going to send a closing word.
Thank you, Kristen, for...
I think we have one more question that just popped up.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. To what degree do you think fear of homosexuality contributes to the evangelical masculinity?
Yeah, it does. It's always kind of lurking as a subtext or text. But I actually say that we might have to think about that in a different order. So I don't talk about LGBTQ issues too explicitly in this book. I could have done much more on that and on abortion. But what I do, I think, and I've heard that it's been received in this way, is I explain the historical context and this incredible emphasis on gender difference that emerges in conservative evangelicalism in this early Cold War era, that moves to the center of evangelical orthodoxy. And again, the assertion of white patriarchal power, which depends on this foundation of gender difference, but which is often meant like opposites. So Dobson will say men and women are different in every cell of their body. So whatever a man is, a woman is the opposite. Whatever a woman is, even if we're talking fruits of the spirit, kindness, gentleness, right? Men are all opposite. So they are not those things. So it's this really splintering of Christian virtue. But once you understand just this ultimate commitment of this kind of oppositional gender difference and claiming that that is the center of Orthodox Christianity, and that not just the fate of Christianity depends on it, but the fate of Christian America depends on it as well, then you can start to see why the questions of abortion, or the issues of abortion and homosexuality, to use the word that they used at the time, became such hot button issues, right? And so we have to understand the historical context, because abortion was not originally a super controversial issue, and certainly not a political issue for many conservative evangelicals in the late 60s. You can have a special issue of Christianity Today where is abortion right or wrong? And the answer is, well, it's really complicated, right? That becomes a partisan political issue over the next decade, but it isn't for many, if not most, evangelicals in the late 60s. LGBTQ, a little bit different story there. And there we have to look at the gay rights movement as well. But there too, the weight placed on that as a defining marker of orthodoxy makes a whole lot more sense if you understand that it strikes at the very heart of this foundational principle, which is gender difference. And so so this fear absolutely lurks in the background of much of these writings, and I make it visible from time to time. But I would also want to say that maybe we can understand why homosexuality became such an issue when the stakes seem so high, if we understand this broader context, the history that I tell.
Kristen, I want to thank you on behalf of Monte Vista Grove and our Convocation Committee for this incredible talk. And we really appreciate it. A lot of applause for you. One thing, it seems to me that we're slowly emerging from this COVID crisis. And a lot of people, I think, are introspecting. They're reflecting in ways that they haven't before. And your book is very much a part of that. And it's a sign of hope for me that your book is having such an influence and widely accepted. So we deeply appreciate you and your book. And thank you for speaking to us.
Oh, thank you so much.
This is the last convocation for the summer. We started last September, never having done virtual convocations before, and it's been a great experience, a great journey. And so we'll take a break for the summer and begin again in September. We picked a theme for the new year. This past year, it's been living into hope. Again, thinking of the COVID crisis as a chance to rethink things and come out with some hopeful new directions. So in the fall, our theme will be cultivating inclusive community. We have a diversity task force here at Monte Vista Grove that's working on diversity for our own community and reflecting on the need for diversity across the country. So that's our theme, and we welcome people to have a good vacation for the summer and come back in September when we will begin again. Thank you again.